Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. With so many resources going into the plant-based meat replacements, the past decades we've made very little progress to reduce the animal protein consumption. In Germany, meat replacements in 2020 were at 0.9%, and we have to reduce animal protein drastically, especially coming from non-regen farms, which are the vast majority. To transition, we need to reduce the pressure by reducing factory-farmed animals' protein yesterday, not in 10 years with cultured meat or other super-processed soy burgers. So what do we do? Meet the blenditarian movement and why it could kickstart the transition to a much more regenerative food system. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the planet mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. In March last year, we launched our membership community to make it easy for fans to support our work. And so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits and how to become a member, check gumroad.com/investingregenag or find the link below. Thank you. Welcome to another episode. Today, rebel meat, more than meat. People want to eat less meat, but Faux's meat is not for everyone. And they have the ambition to become the market maker for regen beef and cultured fat. So welcome, Philipp.
Thank you very much for having us.
And start with a personal question. How did you end up on meat, on rebel meat, but also talking about regeneration and soil?
Yeah, that's a very funny question because I asked that myself a lot, especially given that I actually started a company in the food space before. Back in 2011, I started a recipe box, a nowadays well-known concept. And yeah, it was a very tough business, of course, because the food industry is a tough industry. And so when we actually sold that business to a competitor, I promised myself to never go back into the food space. I was then for a couple of years in the digital world, working for a venture capital firm. But somehow the whole alternative protein space really managed to attract my attention again and really fascinated me.
Do you remember that there was something, if there was something specific, or was it the headlines, or was it the issues of the factory farm, the meat industry? Was there anything that triggered it specifically, or was it a process over time?
Well, I think on the one hand, it's because it touches so many different aspects. Everything you mentioned, right? The whole problem with factory farming, but also, of course, the huge ecological impact, the health impact, etc. But what I think is fascinating actually about the food industry is that we can take decisions 3 times a day and we can have so much impact very fast. Like compare it to our energy system, like power generators, they run for a long time, right?
You change maybe once every 5 or 10 years.
Exactly, right? And so the timelines are so long and decisions we make now have an impact in 10, 15 years. Whereas with the food system, actually, the timelines are much, much shorter. So if consumer demand changes, the food system will follow very fast, actually. And that is what is so fascinating about food. And also that as a startup, I think the food industry is actually a very good entry point because you can actually make a dent, right? You don't need very capital heavy assets. You don't need years and years of R&D. So you can basically go very fast into the market. And if you have the right timing, do your homework, then you can have an impact quite fast, actually.
But I mean, that's all true and well, but you were there at the VC and you could have also just participated as a consumer and did different things. But where did it trigger you and step over your old vow of never getting back into the food industry? What triggered you there to get into it as an entrepreneur again? Because that's a very different mindset and role as maybe an activist or in your free time leading less meat campaigns or getting involved as a consumer 3 times a day. But getting involved again full time, or your time and energy and your work life, that's a different step, especially as you have the experience in the food space.
Yeah, it's a very different step. And I think on the one hand, it was just really this deep inner demand to be an entrepreneur, to actually build something up, to really see your products in the world. And I think that's something that, it comes up and you just want to do it again. And I couldn't wait doing it again, actually. And I think the second thing was I met my co-founder, Cornelia. She's a scientist, and she actually looked also at the whole topic of alternative proteins. And we just challenged each other with different ideas. And we looked at so many different things, from plant-based meat replacements all the way to cultivated meat. And we looked at many different angles, talked to a lot of people. When we finally found this concept of blended meat or hybrid meat, and we saw that there is demand, for example, in the US, there is the so-called blenditarian movement, where people, gather around this idea.
That's the first time I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's kind of a movement, right? And which basically is non-profit, and people gather around the idea. And we saw, okay, so there is something there, but nobody's actually building a product out of it. And what we think is also super important, a brand, because a brand is what tells the story, is what explains the concept to people in a time where everyone has very short attention spans. That's why you need a brand for it. And, we just saw an opportunity, on the one hand, a business opportunity, and on the other hand, great opportunity to make impact now, especially given that, we cannot wait for cultivated meat to solve the problem because it's still years off. And, on the other hand, we have had plant-based replacements for many years already, and the problem is, not solved. So there's got to be another way to solve the problem of excessive meat production and consumption. And so we said, okay, why not try this third way and give it a shot?
And so now everybody's very interested in what this movement and the blenditarian is, and of course, rebel meat. So how would you explain to somebody that completely new to that way of thinking and those products, etc., what you are doing at the moment?
Yeah, so what Rebel Meat is doing is helping people to eat less, but better meat. So we're building products with roughly 50% meat, with the rest being wholesome, fully natural vegetables, mushrooms, etc. And we built that into products like sausages, burger patties, or minced meat to basically give you the full meat experience with just half the meat. And of course, the meat that goes into those products is the most sustainable available. So in our case, nowadays, it's organic meat from the region. But in the future, it might as well be that for some products, it will come from cultivated meat. So basically, our promise is to, offer the customer the most sustainable meat available. And obviously here, regenerative meat comes into play. And we're hoping to be the market maker, as in help build up the supply chain. And once it's available, buy it, of course, and use it in our products. By only using half of it, also make the final products more affordable to the final customer, right? Because blending it with vegetables makes the per kilo price, of course, more affordable in the end.
And so why blend it? I mean, I understand for the price part. Why not just go for 100% vegetable where there are many, and then eat your regenerative meat on the side? What's the logic behind blending?
So there's many arguments for blending. One is simply look at the numbers. There have been plant-based meat replacements for so many years. So people nowadays have a very good selection available, but still the numbers of market share of meat replacement products are so small that whereas the numbers of people saying, I want to eat less meat, are actually quite high. So people recognize the problems we have with meat overconsumption, but they're just not ready, or at least a big proportion of people is just not ready to eat meat replacement products on a regular basis. They may be willing to try it. They may be willing to eat it every now and then. But for the big part, they're not willing to actually reduce their meat consumption. So that's why we think offering them a choice where they can actually have meat, for their lunch or dinner, but just a little bit less, is a very good idea. Plus, what we can do, because we don't have to imitate the taste of meat, because there's actually meat inside.
The flavor is just much better.
Exactly. The flavor is much closer to actual meat and without any artificial ingredients. So we don't use any structured proteins. We don't use any artificial flavors, anything like this. We can just use wholesome.
Are you suggesting that many of the other burgers, let's say the fully plant-based ones, they don't have the easiest labels to read in many cases? Yeah.
Everyone can have their own opinion about this, but clearly that is actually, I think, a big point why plant-based meat replacement products are not seeing the market shares they could have, because some of them have just very long ingredient lists. Definitely.
And do you see this as a transition? You mentioned market maker for regenerative meat. We'll talk about it in a second as well. But do you see like you're starting at 50% meat and then slowly you're going down as people get used to it and you get better at using 40% meat and still have the bratwurst flavor? Or is that a goal as well to lead that transition to 10% or whatever the final number is?
Yeah, so I think going down in the ratio is definitely something that we're looking at, and we're doing projects actually to get there. And that is also because when we look at, for example, cultivated meat also coming up, we know that there's got to be a very low ratios in the final products if we want to make them affordable for the mass markets.
Where do you see the cultivated meat? Like, do you see it on the horizon already? I mean, I see a lot of headlines, but then when I talk to people deep into space, it's always X years away, and big production is, I don't know how many years away. Well, what do you see as you're much deeper in it, obviously, than I am?
Well, clearly it's, I would say, closer than most people on the street would think, but much further away than the headlines of the insiders would suggest. So I think that's kind of the middle ground here.
Are we talking 5 years? I mean, you mentioned cultured fat. Like, when are you even thinking or expecting to have that in any kind of supermarket ready product?
It's really very hard to suggest because there's so many question marks. I mean, we're here in Europe, so we don't even know what the regulators think about this and how long the process is going to take here. And I think also what we don't have any clue about is consumer perception, right? So I think clearly here in the bubble of alternative protein enthusiasts, there is a lot of obviously enthusiasm about the whole concept. But I think we have no idea how the actual consumer perception is going to look like. I know there are many studies, but studies is the one thing. And then once the products are out there on the shelves, this is going to be a very different thing. But nevertheless, we want to prepare ourselves. And we actually have a cooperation agreement with a player in the industry. And we're working on prototypes of using cultured fat in our products because, we want to be able to fulfill that promise to our customers of the most sustainable meat products available.
Why would you go down that route where, I mean, you're doing two routes. You're also doing the regenerative part. Let's say there is a price competitive regenerative or fat grown in a regenerative way with regenerative practices available relatively soon, plus all the LCAs showing negative carbon, so positive environmental impact. Would you then still go the cultured fat route, or is that maybe even a different line of product? How are you thinking there? Let's say in 10 years, both markets have developed a lot, and it's much easier in Austria to get your hands on certified carbon negative beef products or meat products in general. And also the cultured fat has finally arrived. What do you see there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And to be honest, it's going to be a very hard question because how do you define most sustainable, right? Is it only going to be CO2 emissions? Or do you also take animal suffering into account, for example? So I think we'll really have to take a decision based on the kind of meat. So, for example, it might be that we will decide for ourselves, okay, in beef, for example, we will go with the actual regenerative beef. But, for example, with chicken, it's so much more costly to raise them in a very humane way, and that it might just be better to actually go with cultured chicken fat. So that's the kind of decisions we will have to take once we see what is available. And then we will have to, evaluate on many different levels, not just CO2 emissions.
Yeah, no, I understand. You have to look at biodiversity, methane, water, animal welfare, obviously.
Exactly.
Those are quite complex LCAs. Yeah.
Definitely.
And so let's talk about the market maker role you potentially, or you see yourself, or you want to be for the regenerative space. How do you see that playing out, and what needs to happen now? You're buying organic meat at the moment in Austria. You want to go beyond that. What is needed from the sector for you to be able to do that? I understand price, but also in general, what do you need? What kind of role would you like to play there?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's about availability, right? So we couldn't buy regenerative beef today if we wanted, and we want to, but there's no certification system available. And even if there was a certification system available, I don't think the supply chain would be there already. So we would like to see that industry growing up, and we are available basically to help, for example, with, basically just agreeing beforehand to buy certain amounts. And that's the kind of role we want to play, right? And by also helping to tell the story, because regenerative agriculture is not a concept that is well known to the masses. And, once we're building up our consumer brand, and we also see our role to communicate how the meat is produced, how the cattle is grown, etc. That's what we want to do. And so we can also basically command a higher price and also pay that higher price then to the supply chain. That's what we see as our role, basically.
And as a brand developer and a brand person, what do you see in regenerative? I'm asking because we see some signs and signals in the US where there's a bit more research around this and actual people are buying. There seems to be a stronger interest to actually buy. I mean, the research, like you said before, is always tricky, but until people actually are paying at some kind of casa, it's not worth anything. But people seem to be going for, even if the story is quite complex around soil and regeneration and water and methane and all of that, but there seems to be an interest, at least in that story. But of course, we need the brands like you guys to explain and to share and to educate and to inform and to nudge, etc. What attracts you in that regeneration piece? And do you see that is it going to be very difficult, or you actually said it's something that could relatively easily, between brackets, being connected to end consumers in the supermarket that have in the frozen piece maybe 10 seconds to choose, maybe even less? Like how do you see that challenge, or is it not such a challenge?
It's a big challenge. And the big challenge is that actually the advertisement of the meat industry work with the pictures that we want to see in regenerative farming. The problem is that they're not true.
The happy cow and the happy farmer, yeah.
Exactly. So we have all those pictures out there right now, and the consumers happily accept them because it gives them inner peace, somehow knowing, of course, that they're not true, but, just not asking too many questions. So what we somehow have to get to is more transparency, more truthfulness also in the communication. We then can basically be in a better position to communicate the advantages of regenerative agriculture, and without too much finger pointing towards the problems.
Yeah, because you don't want to be the shame.
Exactly.
Like, they are wrong. They are lying on their packaging. We are not. Yeah, that's getting you into a lot of, probably some media, but.
Yeah, but so I think that's the tricky part, in a sea of rosy messages, having probably even less rosy ones, but more truthful ones. So that's going to be the tricky part.
And the fact that you're making blended or hybrid products, probably you don't want to call them hybrid products, but is that also interesting because I'm just completely guessing here, because you're using potentially less interesting pieces of the animal or interesting pieces of that are maybe in the supply chain not as wanted, that you can actually use in sausages, etc. Or is that not the case, and you'll be competing with the rest of competing with the butcher that also wants to sell some regenerative raised beef?
No, that's actually a very important issue here, because especially in regenerative beef, I think generally in the more premium meat industry, we have the problem that only the premium parts are sold, or most of the premium parts are sold. So we have a problem with the not so premium parts. Using them basically is a very important thing here, and
getting a premium for the non-premium parts.
Yeah. Exactly. That's definitely something we're looking at with the whole nose to tail approach, etc. That's something we even in product development already think about. And which is going to be even more important in the future. And I think what you shouldn't say is, you're basically trying to use parts that you can't sell in any other case.
Except dog food. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not a very good branding strategy.
No, definitely not. But what you definitely want to do is increase also the opportunities for the farmers or for the butchers to, basically earn more, because that will also go towards, more sustainable supply chains in the end.
And so what's the current status of Rebel Meat? What kind of products do you have available for people in Austria at the moment and probably beyond to buy? And is it sold in restaurants? And what's the current, we're talking now summer 2021.
Yeah. So we basically have had a burger patty. I think that's the number one use case, I guess, for alternative protein startups, available for a couple of months already, which is sold in select restaurants and in supermarkets nationwide here in Austria. And we have just a couple of weeks ago launched new products in the fresh aisle of the supermarkets, which of course adds certain layers of complexity and planning. But since the fresh aisle has much more sales velocity, it was a super important step for us. And we're now, as mentioned, available with fresh products like sausages, minced meat, and also the burger patty in a second version. And they're all 100% organic from Austria. And now the next step for us is really expanding to other European countries. And the ultimate goal is really to have a European network also of producers to really always make sure we're locally available with local meat, because we believe that's a very important aspect of a more sustainable and regenerative food system. We are also 100% transparent. So with the tracking code on our packaging, you can on our website see down to the farm level where your meat comes from. So these are all aspects that play into a, more sustainable food system.
And how has been the response? Because at the end of the day, if consumers don't choose it in that fresh aisle or the frozen one, compared to the one on the left or the right, it's all nice, but they should make a choice. So how has been the response so far?
Definitely. And I'll be honest, the first response we get is in many times skepticism, right? Is that people say, well, that's not meat and it's not vegetables either. You're in between two chairs.
Which means on the floor.
Yeah, exactly. The good thing though is that many times people think about it later on, and then they think about their own consumption patterns, especially once they try it. They usually say, well, you know what? After all, that's actually a pretty good idea. And I could actually see myself trying that and eating that more often. And we actually have, it's still a small customer base because, we're still beginning. But many of the customers we have are very enthusiastic customers, and they tell, I buy this every week. And I think that's actually the good part, that once we can get people to try it, in many cases we can make them enthusiastic consumers and repeat buyers.
And do you see that as a danger that people, as they see it's less impactful on the climate, that they will increase the quantity of times they eat it per week or something? Have you seen any of that? Like a rebound effect, basically.
Yeah, exactly. We discussed that rebound effect more in terms of people that would have otherwise bought a fully plant-based product. Mm-hmm. So that was a concern we had in the beginning. But we don't have that concern anymore nowadays, because we think, yes, that might happen one or the other time. But we believe in much more of the cases, we get people from the 100% beef to our product. And, it's not only about quantities. It's also about, as you know, obviously, how the supply chain looks like. And both if we get people away from beef that has eaten soy from the Amazonas region here in Austria, but also, to be frank, in some cases, if we get people away from plant-based meat replacement products that use protein powder that was shipped all over the world, it's probably also better to have local beef, local organic beef. So, I think we don't ask ourselves that questions anymore, because we strongly believe that in general, we decrease meat consumption. That's actually our mission, to get meat consumption of the average European from 1.2 kilograms a week down to 300 grams a week.
Wow.
And we see our product is one tool, but we do many other things as well. We have lots of fully veggie recipes on our website. We have a lot of content on how to reduce your meat consumption in general, also without our products. So we see it as a bigger movement, and our products are one instrument to achieve that goal.
And then the other part of the ingredient list, you already mentioned some, let's say, colleagues or competitors have a very complex labels and are highly processed. And I think that's also what you'd mentioned, one of the issues or one of the things holding back a lot of these products that didn't get the market share yet because worries about health, worries about processed food, etc. What are you, as you mentioned, beef, I would like to do that locally as much as possible. What are your thoughts on the vegetable side? You're buying organic, obviously, but are you also making steps there in terms of farming practices, in terms of figuring out, okay, how are these vegetables grown instead of only looking for the label?
Yeah, to be honest, not yet, because just lack of resources. And it's a very complex issue, of course. So we're trusting the organic certification at this point. And we will probably also focus on the meat supply side because it probably has the bigger impact for the foreseeable future. But surely that's something that we also cannot forget. And we have to at some point look more closely into this, if only for, availability. Because if we grow the way we want to grow, we will have to work more closely with the farmers and with distributors, etc., to make sure we have the quantities we need. And of course, then we will also be in a position to bring forward what we would like to see in terms of farming practices.
Great. And so to shift gears a bit, what would you, obviously without giving investment advice, what would you tell smart investors that are listening? Like there's a whole room of investors listening to this podcast that are very interested in bringing down global meat production and obviously making it much more sustainable and regenerative, but also seeing all the headlines of all the money and attention and resources going into a very small niche at the moment in the market. What would you tell them if this is the first time they heard about blended, etc.? Where would you advise them to look or to start looking, to start tasting, to start exploring more where maybe not so many others are going?
Yeah, as you already mentioned, there's a lot of attention being given right now to making meat go away. And I think that's probably a little bit too much attention, given that there's very little attention given to making meat sustainable itself, because there are so many different angles on how to actually do that. And the opportunity is so big given the market share of actual meat in the meat market, which is over 99%.
Just to have an idea, like in Austria, what is the current, with all the attention we've had about meat replacement, what is the current balance between plant-based versus maybe in burgers and in mincemeat or whatever, if you want to pick something specific, but what's the current ratio?
Yeah, so I can give you the number for Germany because I have the latest number for 2020 and it's 0.9% meat replacement market share in the meat market. So that leaves 99% or more than 99% for actual meat. And I think trying to make that 99% more sustainable is such a big opportunity.
Because most of that is going to be factory farmed, like of that 99%.
Most of that is going to be factory farmed with feed that is imported from mostly South America. And I've read a study, just reducing meat consumption by 20% in the European Union could help us to completely abandon feed imports.
Wow.
Which is crazy, right? Because this has such a big impact on deforestation in the Amazon, etc., that this is really a big issue.
And the European Union is still promoting meat consumption. You still see the ads, very well lobbied by the factory farmed beef industry or the meat industry, but you still see European Union paid for ads to push meat. And that's quite staggering.
It's crazy. And it's really hard to understand why this would be, because actually everyone could win if we could just transition the system to a more sustainable supply chain. Then that would mean that their business models are not basically endangered of going out of business, but they could actually probably earn more money in the long term if they manage to shift the market to less but better meat. Because in this system of cheap meat, nobody wins. And that's a really important message.
The input companies wins. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, but it's not a very good industry to be in at whatever point in the value chain you are, to be honest. Yeah? And so I think if we could transition the whole system towards more quality and less quantity, everyone could win. And that's such an important message.
So you would definitely focus the attention of investors, but also entrepreneurs. I think that we need a lot more people building things in the space, in general, in the regeneration space, and a lot more people thinking about transitions of different pieces of the value chain. If it's grain, if it's meat, which potentially has the highest upside in terms of environmental impact and the highest downside at the moment. But we have to think about those two transitions and getting there in 10, 15 years max. So we need a lot more attention for that. And if you could change one thing in the agriculture space, in the food space in general, if you had a magic wand and tomorrow morning Philipp had changed one thing, what would that be?
It's probably the same as in any other industry. To make any industry more sustainable, you need to have externalities included into costs and therefore ultimately into prices. And that is true for any industry, but of course in agriculture and food, it's the most burning issue probably. And what we need to achieve that is transparency. And I think if we had 100% transparency about where our feed is grown, how the animals are held that are being turned into meat, then the food system would change tomorrow. And that is the thing I would change with the magic wand.
Because you think information and transparency is enough to get the consumer moving? Because as you said before, most people know somewhere in the back or even in the front of their mind what is happening. I mean, they drive past these anonymous buildings with a big silo on the side and know that pigs are being tortured in there. I mean, it's not that, and they see the videos, the shock videos coming from butchers, etc., certain butchers. So is that enough, or it needs to be much more in your face? I mean, we also know smoking is bad. So it's not like, is that enough, or does it need to be, okay, we include the externalities in the price and it just shoots up or transitions over time to make a much fairer price for everyone?
I mean, ultimately, of course, you're right. The prices need to reflect the realities, because otherwise it's just unfair for the unsustainable practices. And there will always be people who don't care and who just go for the cheapest prices. But I think there could also be a lot done if we just make the connection from knowing something abstract to basically actually making the relationship to the actual product that is on the shelf that I'm buying right now. And I think that is actually quite a thing, because there are these stories of people when they are in a restaurant and they can pick their own fish, for example, in a little aquarium, or they need to pick it themselves. They don't like to eat the fish anymore. Whereas if they had just chosen it on the menu without seeing the actual fish, they would have just enjoyed it. So I think making that connection is probably already a big step, but I agree that ultimately it needs to be reflected in the prices.
Yeah, we just saw a study coming out, I'll put it in the show notes, of the Rockefeller Foundation in the US, of the price they pay, or the price of food in the US, which what people spend is about 1.1 trillion, I think, a year. And actually the price of the food system and agriculture system, which is 3 times as much, looking at health, looking at the environment. And so basically the price tag is 3x compared to the actual price people pay, and doesn't reflect it at all. And of course, we can ask a lot of questions about the methodology and the true price accounting and true price foundation. But it really, if it's 3 times or 2.5 or 4.5, doesn't really matter. It's just way more than anybody ever imagined. What is the cost we pay for the food we have, for the quantity, as you said, over quality.
And that could actually go down though, because once people see that or would have to pay the actual prices, then they would shift to cheaper options, right? And that's exactly the shift we want to see. And that is actually something that I would also urge people in the regenerative industry to not forget, that just shifting to regenerative practices is super important, but it's probably not enough. We also still need to change consumption patterns. Like, we need to eat less meat in order to be able to produce all our meat in a regenerative way. Similar to, e-mobility, for example. We cannot just keep on driving the way we drive and just do it with e-cars. We also need to change our mobility patterns. And that's something that needs to happen in the food industry as well.
Yeah, otherwise we'll be stuck in the same traffic jam, but just with electric cars. And
exactly.
We need to leave the car for most of the trips we do and go to an e-bike or whatever other smaller, that's not moving a lot of aluminium and a lot of air around for no reason. And the same with animal protein. It has to be reduced drastically, even though there are a lot of people, and I'm going to get emails for sure, saying that the carrying capacity of a lot of land is a lot higher and most of animal farmers and livestock farmers are understocked and overgrazed. But there's a lot of meat that we need to replace first before we can start thinking about, okay, what's the optimum level? And probably for health, we're eating too much anyway to begin with. So it's, there's a big discussion to have there. What's the actual carrying capacity of the planet when you look at animal protein and vegetables and all of that, and nuts and obviously grain, which are a few of the biggest crops there. And as you have a background in both entrepreneurship and investors, I always like to ask this question, but I'm very curious about this one as well. What would happen if you be in charge of a large investment fund, let's say €1 billion? So you start tomorrow investing, you no longer have your magic power as you can change one thing in the food system, but you can invest quite a lot of money and resources into it. What would be your priorities? What would you focus on as you have to invest and not grant?
Yeah, it's of course a very, very tricky question. There is one thing that I'm thinking about actually, because I exchange notes with a lot of entrepreneurs that work on sustainable food products. And we all have such a hard life because we're all so small. And our lives would be much easier if we were in bigger organizations. Of course, that brings other problems, but it also brings scale and negotiation power, etc. So I think there might be a case for sustainable food brands to be consolidated once they reach a certain level and have proven certain things and, don't need the entrepreneurial power as much anymore. And basically, in the buy and build case, build kind of a sustainable FMCG company and therefore achieve economies of scale and negotiation power, etc. Because I think the case of Danone has shown how hard it is to change such a company from the inside. So it might be worth a shot building such a big company from the outside by consolidating sustainable food startups.
Yeah, a bit like Live Kindly is doing in the vegan space.
Exactly.
Raised a lot of money, huge media piece, and keep buying basically beyond startups that are getting to a certain scale. And it's, we have to see. The case is definitely not done yet, but it's an interesting approach to see because, you are in a space where you have to sell to supermarkets, which have a lot of buying power. So if you are able to move together, you are in a space where you work with processors that have a lot of buying power. And if you make a few burgers compared to a lot, of course, there's a difference. And then with the suppliers, etc.
Yeah.
So, and has it been difficult for you and the others you've been sharing notes with to raise capital in the space, or there is a tension for, say, the more sustainable approaches instead of the vegan ones, which don't seem to have any issues raising? But has it been tricky for you to raise capital, or has it been relatively okay?
I think depends on what's your reference point, right? So
you did it before, so
yeah. So of course, I can reference it to the digital world, and I think it's definitely harder than in the digital world, which I can probably relate to because obviously, in terms of scalability and capital efficiency, there might be models in the digital world that are easier to do, but I think the price or the reward you get is ultimately potentially bigger than other models. So I think especially in the beginning, it's probably harder to raise pre-seed, seed, etc. money. But once you have shown some proof points, then I think it's actually just as easy, probably with less multiples, just given the gross margins of food businesses compared to digital businesses. But I think it's just as good a business as any other business, and probably even better given the sustainable and regenerative thoughts behind it.
And as a final question, where do you think, there are many points we already touched on, but where do you think different compared to the space? What do you believe to be true about regenerative ag and food that others don't? This is definitely inspired by John Kemp. So where are you contrarian in this movement? Beyond the points, maybe it's one of the points you already mentioned, but where do you really see yourself different?
Yeah, I think that's actually the point discussed earlier is probably the biggest one, right? That we cannot just transition everything to regenerative and done deal, but we really have to reduce and change our consumption patterns. And that's why I actually believe that our product is not just a transition product. And once we are regenerative, then we can again eat just 100% beef hamburgers, but that actually having these kind of blended meat products in one or the other form definitely has a long-term future, because also in a regenerative setting, the vegetables will always have the lower footprint compared to meat. So, or probably, of course, in a regenerative sense, you would have to see it as a systemic system. So it's probably hard again to, divide one by the other. But in any case, see it not only CO2, but see it in a total LCA point of view. Yeah, we will just have to reduce and get into a balanced system of animal-based and plant-based. And therefore, the blended meat products will always be required.
I want to thank you so much, Philipp, for your time today in a very, very busy period as you're scaling and getting products into supermarkets and into places, for taking out some time to share about the blenditarian movement, which is going to go into the dictionary, I hope, soon. So thank you so much for your time today and good luck.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for your important work in this field.
If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you and if you have the means, please join my membership community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on gumroad.com/investingregenag or in the description below. Thank you so much and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.